So yeah, pretty bold title today. We're going to talk a little bit about how a lot of us in the industry, including ourselves, including myself, are screwing this whole SaaS thing up. And what we're really going to dig deep on is basically this whole concept of the fact that the market has moved pretty dramatically. Some of us in the room, have been in the game for a long time. Others of us haven't been, in this game as long. And what's really, really kind of fascinating, though, is that a lot of the playbooks that we continue to use in order to grow are rather old school. And so we're going to go through a ton of data. We're going to share the slides to kind of, make sure that you don't have to write every little thing down. You can make sure you can get everything afterwards. But we're going to basically unpack this and then focus on a few of the tactics that at least the data suggests that you should think about no matter the stage of your business. Just a little bit of background on me and us and all the things that we do. Patrick Campbell, CEO, founder of ProfitWell. My background's in econometrics and math. So I started my career, I worked in the US intelligence community in DC. I then worked at Google, basically building models in order to find bad guys and gals when I worked at NSA, and then find money when I worked at Google. Interestingly enough, the same types of models were used for different things. And then started ProfitWell about 7 years ago. And as was mentioned, we help subscription companies with kind of the hard parts of growth. We have a couple of different products. One of our core products is a free subscription financial metrics product. So you can plug it into your billing system, whether you're using Chargeify, Zora, Stripe, whatever you're using, and basically gives you access to some really, really deep metrics for free. So you can look at your cohorts, your churn, all that kind of fun stuff. And then the way that we make money is we have a couple of different products that basically help with different parts of growth. Retain basically helps reduce your churn. You just plug it in and then it attacks some mechanical pieces of churn. We have a revenue recognition product, and then finally we have Price Intelligently, which we've had around for a long time, which is some software to help with your pricing. I'm not giving you this context in order to sell you. That's probably like the worst sales pitch ever. But what's kind of cool is we have about 20% of the entire subscription market using one or more of our products. So we're sitting on a ton of data that helps us see like what's working, what's not in the market, and it allows us to kind of break things down to actually have some good data-informed growth rather than just kind of like throwing up a bunch of stuff up against the wall and seeing what sticks, which is what most of us do in order to grow our businesses. So we're going to unpack this. This is my email address for the slides. I'll share it again at the end. But let's dig in. You guys ready? You good? All right, let's go. So let's first understand a little bit of our history in this world of SaaS. And the reason I put this in here is because I think a lot of us don't realize where a lot of the things or the best practices that we have been told really come from. And it really comes from the basics of how we used to build our businesses and how we actually build the infrastructure of our businesses today. And in the beginning, IBM created the mainframe, and it was good, right? Everything was great. It was awesome, right? Now we had this world where all of a sudden we had computing power that we could rent or we could own depending on how much money we had. And all of a sudden when we were building different products, it was in this world of very prehistoric SaaS. And what I mean by that is that everything was like focused on building, really, really cool things in our garages, actually focusing on the actual hardware and putting together all of this work in order for us to basically have these like server farms or these server rooms that cost a lot of money, took a lot of time, and everything that we did in our businesses was basically focused on getting speed to market. How can we build more stuff? How can we make sure that the market and our product is actually stable? Because owning and basically managing servers was just really, really painful, and ultimately evangelizing this whole thing of like using software or using the internet even. And I know some of us, youngsters in the room here, were a little bit like, oh, this is of course how things work. But when you think about where a lot of like our thinking comes from in building product, we have to realize that everything was about basically building more and more stuff as quickly as possible because there just wasn't that much stuff out there. It was one of those things where it was like, if you're building a CRM, it was actually like not easy because of all this infrastructure, but it was easy in the sense of, hey, we're creating a more user-friendly database, right? Which is hard to think about, but it was all about that product side of product market fit. Now, what's super interesting is that as things were kind of moving forward, all of a sudden we had all of the fun tools that we use today, right? We had this subscription golden age, where all of a sudden it got easier and easier to build more and more things, and so we started building a lot of stuff on top of things like AWS. All of a sudden, if you wanted to basically store your code or develop code collaboratively, we had things like GitHub. If you had problems with payments or things like that, you could spin up Stripe. If you're an enterprise company that had problems with payments, you could use something like Zora. And all of a sudden, there was just all this stuff that made it easier to build things. And so all of a sudden, we were in this market where you get this explosion in the past 15 years of more and more products that were coming to market. And then we had our demigods, I don't know how to characterize them, but you have someone like Mark Benioff, who kind of had the first really, really big SaaS company that came to be. And then you had folks like Gail Goodman, who actually started Constant Contact before Mark Benioff started Salesforce. But we had all this new products that was very, very focused on you building a business and ultimately making sure that you could get things moving forward with your business. And this is what gave us the most overused slide in every marketing presentation known to man, which is the MarTech technology landscape, right? So all of this ability to build stuff quickly gave us, thousands and thousands of products that were all like, hey, we help you grow your business, right? But then we got some really cool stuff, right? So if you wanted to find love, now all of a sudden we had Match.com, now we have Tinder, we have a bunch of other things. If you want to get ready for those dates, you have Peloton, right? Subscription software, even though it's in the home. And if you don't want to date and you want to have really awkward teenage years, you can, play World of Warcraft, right? And that's one of those things where, all of a sudden, we had this whole online world, right, where things were easier and easier to build. We had things that were basically scaling things out. Now, we got very, very lucky in terms of distribution at this point. It was very, very lucky because what was happening, as it got easier and easier to build more and more product, and as we were pushing product faster and faster, we're using Agile, Kanban, all these really, really cool product frameworks, all of a sudden sales and distribution channels were opening up every single quarter. Anyone remember penny per click ads on Google? Anyone here? No? We used to be able to buy Google ads for a penny a click. It was an amazing world, right? And then every single quarter, you had things like the Google Display Network, Google Remarketing, you had content marketing, social channels, all kinds of other fun things coming out that basically allowed you to build stuff really, really quickly and distribute that stuff really, really quickly, right? So this is why it was the golden age of building in SaaS, because you didn't have to have that great of a product. You didn't necessarily have to have that great of a market, and you could kind of brute force a product within a market in order to be successful. And everything was awesome until it wasn't, right? And this is kind of where we are now, because all of a sudden there was just so much going on that all of a sudden our customers were just like, oh my God, stop spamming me with cat things. I don't need all of these products. It doesn't necessarily need to be this dense in the market. And that got really, really hard for us as practitioners. Acquisition costs increased substantially. A customer that might have cost you about $100 in both B2B and in B2C 6-7 years ago, that customer now costs you close to about $170 today. And that's just because everyone's using these channels. We haven't had a brand new marketing channel probably in 3-4 years. Last one being something like Snapchat. And this is why we're reinventing all of these channels, right? ABM is amazing, but if you ask anyone who's been in the game for 20 years, they're like, isn't this just email and good sales, right? And of course, it's more complicated than that, and it's a lot more nuanced than that. But at the end of the day, that's what's causing all of this constraint happening here. In addition to this, because there was just so much ease in building product, where all of us, if we wanted to build a brand new product by the end of the day, we could spin up a server, we could spin up a website, start driving traffic to the website. Probably wouldn't be that great of a product, but all of a sudden we could actually do it. That's led to a lot of competition. The average number of competitors that you would have in your first year of business, if you started about 5-6 years ago, was about 3. If you started your business about a year or 2 ago, you're gonna have double-digit competitors on day 1. And it's because of the ability to build so many things in the market. And what happened is that value for these products has actually tanked. Software isn't as magical, and products aren't as magical as they once were. You used to be able to put basically a nice, pretty face on a database, and you were amazing, right? Now, if it doesn't have good design, doesn't have good support, doesn't have the right features, you're not even gonna get the phone call. We've actually seen this in not only core features, but also all of those different pieces that you used to add to a product in order to boost value. And products that were worth, let's say, $1,000 6-7 years ago, they've lost about 70% of their value. Not all products, but these value cycles are getting tighter and tighter because there's just so much more stuff out there. And to kind of give you this last little kick in the face, and I apologize for that, customer satisfaction has plummeted. So we looked at aggregate NPS scores for, I believe, about 1,800 different companies, and we found out that 5-6 years ago, the average NPS across a bunch of different industries was about 34, and the average NPS about a year ago was right around 10. And I don't think anyone's gonna stand up and say, like, products are worse today than they were 5, 6 years ago, right? But it's just the nature of the market. And what's scary about this is it's sad, right? Like, how do you build, like, really, really good product in this market? But another way to actually look at this is, we've arrived, right? Like, a lot of us don't appreciate, like, how hard it was to build product back in the day. Like, I certainly don't, because I wasn't, alive in certain instances back in the day when this stuff was getting built. But the funny thing is that a lot of our practices in this new market are basically following the same practices that we were using 5, 10, 15 years ago, rather than focusing on where the market is actually today and building growth through that manner. And so I want to walk through a couple of things that we're just not getting right. It's positioned in a negative way, but I promise you there's some, like, really good tactical things that you can use to kind of build you up here. I think we're going to go through about 4 or 5 different pieces that should hopefully help you kind of just rejigger where you think growth actually comes from. And the first one here is most of us are only focused on acquiring customers. We heard this through a couple of other customer success talks today, but the beauty of a subscription, and it doesn't matter what type of subscription you have, or even if you're just like recurring revenue, the beauty of kind of this recurring revenue world is that everything that you're doing is driving a customer to a point of conversion or justifying the product or the price that you're offering that particular customer. And what's cool about that is that subscriptions are all about relationships, right? So it's not about just acquiring that customer, it's about monetizing that customer and then keeping that customer around for a long time. And it's the first revenue model in the history of humankind where the relationship is actually built into how you make money. So if the customer continues to like the product, they get value from it, they're gonna stick around. If they don't get value anymore, then all of a sudden they're gonna leave. But what we'll find is that most of us in our businesses, if we really break down where our time and our money goes, it's mostly spent just on acquiring that customer, not on keeping them, not on monetizing them. And what's kind of interesting, just to kind of play with the audience a little bit here, we did a study with about 1,200 different SaaS companies, and we broke down their expenses. We looked at all of the money that was going to acquiring customers, all of the money that was going to product, all of the money that was going to operations, retention, monetization. Any guess at what the median percentage of expenses that went to acquisition? 30%? Anyone else? What do you think, Gene? 70%. That's a old school CMO there. She knows the truth, right? The median was 57%. So half of that group, they were spending more on acquisition, half that group was spending less, but it's still the majority of the spend and the majority of the mindset that we have in our companies goes to acquisition. Now, what's interesting about this is that acquisition has now become more table stakes. So remember, because of that density in the market and because value is going down, all of a sudden we're seeing the impact of just acquiring that customer go down as well. So we built a model with about 800 different companies, and we wanted to isolate if we improve each of the main growth levers in a recurring revenue business, acquiring customers, monetizing customers, retaining customers, which lever had more of an impact. So what we found is that if you improve your acquisition by 1%, meaning your net new leads, your conversion volume, et cetera, you're gonna see about a 2 to 3% boost in your bottom line, your revenue. Now, if you improve your monetization by 1%, your ARPU, or your retention by 1%, your churn rate measured through multiple different means, you're actually seeing about 4 to 8x the impact as improving that acquisition. Now, don't get me wrong, 1% improvements on monetization and retention are certainly much harder than a 1% improvement on acquisition. But if we really, really evaluate how much time and money we spend on acquiring customers versus how much time we spend on monetizing and retaining those customers, we probably should spend a little more time with those last 2 growth levers rather than all of that time on the first growth lever. And this isn't to say that you're gonna reduce that 57% to 25%. Like, it's unrealistic, right? But the average amount of time people spend on pricing is actually less than 15 hours per year. Retention's a little bit more than that. It's almost triple, but that's still not a lot of time. We can probably spend a little bit more time on those other 2 growth levers, mainly because pricing and retention have 4 to 8x the impact on your overall growth. So the other thing that we noticed that a lot of companies are doing is we're building the wrong product. And what I mean by this is that a lot of us, if we ask any luminary of Silicon Valley and we say, like, well, what's the one thing? If you had to boil everything down to one thing, what should we focus on? A lot of times what they're gonna say is focus on your customer, right? You've all heard something like this before. You've read a Forbes article. You've read something, right, that talks about this, right? The problem is that most of us hear this advice, and then when push comes to shove, we react something like this. Well, Steve Jobs didn't talk to his customers, so I don't need to talk to my customers, right? Now, controlling for the fact that you're narcissistically comparing yourself to Steve Jobs, the other thing that's really interesting about this is that Apple's actually one of the top 5 buyers of market research every single year, even during the Steve Jobs eras. So it's not about necessarily not talking to your customers, it's about actually talking to your customers about the right things and asking the right questions. But just to give you a little bit of context on like how little we actually do our research, any guesses as the average number of research calls that we have per month in the SaaS industry? How many calls do you think? 30. It's less than 10. Or most of us, it's less than 10. 7 out of 10 SaaS companies, and just to be super clear, this is not only Johnny and Jane startups who are doing less than $1 million, these are also companies doing well over 50 million in ARR. We're just not talking to our customers, right? And the problem here is that we end up building the wrong product. And to introduce this concept, I want to introduce a framework that you probably haven't seen before, but it's actually super, super useful for looking at your monetization, your product, even your retention. And it's a nice little classic 2x2. Any MBAs in the room? No MBAs? Wow. This is like your like catnip, right? You guys love 2x2s. But when you talk about any product, it doesn't matter if it's a cup of coffee, piece of software, piece of enterprise software, you have 2 axes of value. The first axis of value is the actual features or attributes of that particular product. So for a cup of coffee, it's things like the taste, the country of origin, the temperature, these types of things. The other axis of value is the actual price, the willingness to pay. And what I can do using some methods that I don't have time to go through today is I can survey this room, San Francisco, a sample of the world, whatever I'm looking for, and I can find out that when push comes to shove, when you compare the different features for a cup of coffee, the number 1 feature, the most valued feature out of all the other features is taste. I can then find out that you're pretty indifferent about temperature, and then country of origin, it's the least valued feature. It doesn't mean that no one values that feature, but it does mean it's the least valued relative to the other ones. Now, if I cross-reference some data on pricing or willingness to pay on this, I can find out that those of you who care about temperature are willing to pay about 30% more. Those who care about, taste 30% more. Those who care about country of origin, the hipsters in the room, you care and are willing to pay about 40% more. There's not a lot of you, but you're still willing to pay. And those who care about temperature, you're willing to pay about 20% less. Now, what's cool about this is if I find a feature or an attribute of a particular product that indexes high in terms of preference and also has high willingness to pay, I have a differentiable feature. If I find a feature or an attribute that has low value relative to the other features, but the people who care about that feature are willing to pay more, I have an add-on. A feature that's high value relative to the other ones, but the people aren't willing to pay for it, even the ones who really care, that's a core feature. And then finally, my favorite quadrant is trash, right? Now what we did is we went out to about 1,300 product leaders, and we asked them, we made sure they understood everything, we tested them and made sure they understood what they were looking at here. We asked them, for your last N features, as many as you want, where do you think those features landed on those quadrants? And this is what they said for just under 5,000 features. A lot of value, a lot of confidence in product people, right? Because they wouldn't build something that wasn't valuable, right? The problem is we then went out to about 1.2 million different customers of these products. And using some of the methodologies that we've developed over the past 7 years or so, we actually measured where real relative preference was and where real willingness to pay was. And this is what the customers said, right? And we laugh a little bit, right? But if we really think about how much research or the lack thereof that we're actually doing around value, not what people want, but where they actually find value, it's hard not to see that this kind of comparison isn't necessarily that far off from what's happening in our business. Because if we go back to the history of SaaS, we were just so focused on shipping things as quickly as possible that it led to product teams that are just so focused on dev productivity rather than dev productivity and building the right things. And it's scary. And I know this is depressing, right? This is really sad. I didn't give you enough things to build your business. I just gave you things that are wrong, right? So I want to give you a couple of things that are super, super tactical for you. Some that require some work, some that require no work or very minimum work. So I can leave you with something and making sure that you don't want to murder me after I give this presentation here. So the first thing is utilizing what's called a value metric. And this is the one thing that if you solve this inside your business, you can get most of your retention wrong, most of your pricing wrong, and you'll still be doing pretty okay. And a value metric, for those of you who don't know, is essentially pricing based on some sort of unit of value. So it could be per user, per 100 visits, per 1,000 widgets, whatever it ends up being. If you look at Intercom's old pricing here, they were actually pricing based on the number of people that went through the platform. Intercom's a messaging product, for those of you who don't know. One of their competitors, Drift, like straight up competitor here, they actually priced mainly on seats, and they got rid of their contact or their people-based pricing pretty recently. So it's one of those things where you have competitors in different markets using very, very different value metrics or very, very different pricing. Now, the importance of finding a value metric really comes into when you look at growth and also when you look at churn. Because what happens with a value metric is people are only really paying for where they're finding value or their actual usage, which hopefully is ascribed with value. And what that means is that you'll get a lot more upgrades, a lot more expansionary revenue because more and more people are able to use that product. And you also avoid the problem where you might be charging Disney and Johnny or Jane Startup the exact same price for very, very different usage of your product. And so we split this out where we took a group of companies that are pure value metric-based pricing, and then we took a group of companies that were pure feature differentiated pricing, and we wanted to compare growth rates. These are the extremes here. And what we found is the light green here, these are the value metric-based companies. Hand over fist just doubled in terms of growth compared to those who are strictly feature differentiated. And this was because they were able to get customers along the entire demand curve. But in addition to that, they weren't having as much churn. We actually noticed that those companies that were using a value metric, those right two lines here, when compared to those who were just feature differentiated, basically, which is the leftmost line here, basically had about half the churn. And this is where the beauty of the value metric comes into play. Because you might have those downgrades and that contraction revenue that comes into play, but all of a sudden you're not actually going to see those people churn out because they're still getting value from the product. So that helps bake so much growth into your pricing that even if you don't spend a lot of time on your pricing, even if you don't spend a lot of time on your retention, it's baked that growth right into how you actually make money. If that's a little too much work, because that does take some work to get the right value metric, a really, really easy one is price localization. But what I mean by this is that making sure if you have, let's say, over 20 to 30% of your customers outside of your home region, you're a really good candidate for this. And what it means is that you're making sure that your actual prices are localized to different regions that you sell into, meaning different countries, different continents, et cetera. And the reason that this is so powerful is because different markets react very, very differently to different products. There's different competition, there's different demand, there's different expectations. And what's kind of cool is that even if you just cosmetically update your price, meaning it's the same effective price in the UK and in the United States, but the currency symbols are updated, you actually can get some growth as well. What you're looking at here is essentially growth of ARPU, average revenue per user. On the far left here, this is basically indexed growth of ARPU for no localization. One step up is cosmetic localization, where you're just updating the currency symbol. And then finally, the rest of these lines are basically people who did multi-region localization, meaning the effective price in the UK was very different than the effective price in the United States, and so on and so forth. And the reason this works, as I mentioned, there's just different purchasing power parity in different countries. And you're seeing this in about 1.5 million data points across many, many different products, where indexed across the against the United States, somewhere like the Nordics, if you were selling into the Nordics and I didn't know the product, I would still tell you to raise that price 25 to 30% for that region. If you're selling into Southeast Asia, I would tell you, not knowing the product, you should lower your price by 35 to 40% at least. And there's companies that have used this very, very well. Netflix, this is how they differentiate their pricing. They do really well. Evernote, this is maybe not the thing that saved them, but this is something that really, really helped in the past 5 years that they implemented. And it's also something that it's a really good first starter project for pricing, because in order to make this happen, you have to get your engineering stack all ready to go. You have to make sure that your billing system is set up properly, all that kind of fun stuff. So localize your pricing. One that is super tactical, that's even simpler than optimizing for localization, is optimize for term. And what I mean by this is a lot of us just sell monthly or just annually. We only sell one type of term for our products. And then we don't ask our customers, except for maybe when they sign up, to get on a longer term or to get on a different term. And this is one of the most underutilized tactics I see in a lot of different companies. And the reason that this is so powerful, particularly in getting someone on an annual contract versus a monthly, is basically its churn dynamics. So what you're looking at here is basically annual contracts On the bottom here, the x-axis, you're looking at the percentage of contracts that were annual for that company, and then you're looking at their churn rates on the y-axis. And basically, the more annual contracts you tend to have, it at least correlates with lower churn. Now, there's a lot of different lurking variables here. There's obviously lots of companies that force annuals for everyone, but this is a really, really good tactical thing that you can do to reach out to them once they've hit day 34, or reach out to them when they've reached the 3rd month. These types of things so that you can extend that lifetime value of those customers and basically bake it into your whole modeling plan. Cool, a couple of rapid fire things, just because we're coming up on time here. One, don't discount over about 20%. Move your list price if you find yourself discounting over 20%. The reason is we've seen that discounts over 20% typically highly correlate with more churn. Because normally what's happening is you get to the end of the quarter, end of the month, sales team wants to push basically a bigger discount to get things over the line, but those customers just weren't ready for the A team. But they're like, okay, you're giving me 50 to 60% off, great. And then what ends up happening is like the next term comes up and they haven't implemented, they haven't used the product, and they end up churning out. So again, relationships, not just acquisition. I'm not saying don't do any discounts, just be a lot more sparingly and use them like a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer. Support, brand, and design, they are so much more impactful today than they were 5 to 10 years ago. What we've noticed in the data over time is that all 3 of these levers, basically willingness to pay, I think at a minimum, is higher at a rate of like 20%, meaning if you have customers who view your brand or your support or your design as great or good, basically their willingness to pay is at least 20% higher than those who just have a neutral perspective of your support. And that used to be closer to like 5%, 5-10 years ago. So that's where like it's something that takes a lot of time to be really good at these 3 things, but it's one of those things to kind of take care of. Credit card failures. Boggles my mind. It's 20 to 40% of your churn, like if you're a credit card-based business, and it's one of those things that's a mechanical churn, right? It's not something that like, hey, we didn't like this feature, or we didn't like this product. It's one of those things that if you have a credit card-based business, this is somewhere that you can focus. There's infinite things you can do, but just doing the basics will actually help you a lot here. And then finally, like freemium. I know it's a little controversial, but it's something that you should start to consider. And the reason for this, not for all products, but the reason considering freemium is becoming more and more powerful is because if you remember all that density that was happening in the market and value going down, we're moving to a place where customers have a lot more power in the purchasing process. And what's happened is that basically you want customers to convert on their terms rather than your terms. And when you force them in a sales process or in a free trial, you're putting it on your terms. And what ends up happening is that lead, they might make a no decision just because it wasn't the right time, because timing is so crucial in sales. And then you lose the opportunity to have that relationship over time. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. So what we're seeing is that retention is about 15 to 20% higher for those customers who converted from free rather than converted from just a cold start or a free trial. And then you also have lower CAC. I think CAC is like 25 to 30% lower for those customers who converted from free than those who converted from a cold start or a free trial. Cool? Everyone get some value? I can sit up here all day. So I'm going to get to your question in 1 second here. The biggest thing I want to leave you with, the world has changed. I know a lot of people tell you that in presentations, but the world truly has changed from a market perspective. And you cannot control how the world has changed from a market perspective. You can only control how you react. And so, yes, some of you, there might be some asterisks with some of this data. You're like, well, we only do annuals, so maybe look at doing a 2-year term, or maybe that's not a really good place where you can tactically reduce churn. But it is one of those things where you have to think a little bit more logically and have to think a little bit more of a framework basis through your growth in a SaaS ecosystem now, rather than you have to do about 10, 15 years ago. But a lot of our advice is still like it's 10, 15 years ago. So it's not 2005 anymore. You got to make sure you're actually growing in the right way, or at least in the most logical way you can. We do free benchmark audits. So we have 20% of the market, and so you can hook up to ProfitWell through Chargeify or whatever you're using. And for free, we can actually show you similar companies from like an ARPU and a churn perspective. So I'm more than happy to hook you up with those. And if you have any other questions, obviously my email address is patrick@profitwell.com.